Hello everyone, this is Pawan Khera. India has had a very long, successful journey in terms of immunization programs. We've seen India conquer polio. We've seen the universal immunization program of 1985 under Rajiv Gandhi. And we've seen how India managed to take everyone along and convince its vast population, diverse population, to come out of their cultural doubts, suspicions, apprehensions, and participate in this mission of universal immunization. And we did that successfully. I have with us two Sherpas who steered India's journey in 1985, tough period, trying to convince the scientific community, trying to convince the political class, trying to convince the media, Mr. Sam Pitroda and Mr. Jairam Ramesh. I hope all of us learn from this wisdom which India has, the experience, the rich experience that India has in conquering various pandemics throughout several decades of our journey. We have with us two people who frankly don't need any introduction. Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Mr. Sam Pitroda. The world knows them as people who've brought in fresh new ideas into governance, into public policy, and helped India achieve what it has achieved. So to say that this government should take advantage of the kind of wisdom we have at our disposal as a country is being very ambitious. But we've seen that whether it's Dr. Manmohan Singh's letter, whether it's Sonia Ji's letter, whether it's Mr. Rahul Gandhi's suggestion, or whatever suggestions that we have tried to give to this government, very reluctantly, they have had to accept those suggestions because it's in the interest of the country, frankly. So India's journey at achieving the universal immunization has had people like Mr. Jairam Ramesh and Sam Pitroda, not just as witnesses of history, but as people who've been kind of travel guides in that journey. They've guided governments, they've guided political leaderships, and we've achieved what we've achieved. So let's start with Mr. Sam Pitroda. What's the difference you see in the India of 80s when you changed the immunization program to UIP, and India of the 21st century, which we are in today, facing this crisis?
Thank you, Pawan. Thank you for the opportunity. And I'm delighted to be with Jairam Ramesh, who made a substantial contribution in the early days on immunization. So let's go back a little bit to give you an idea of how it all started. Rajiv Gandhi had this dream to take India into 21st century with pride, with focus on Indian values, enhanced democracy, freedom, and part of that equation was to really focus on our children, because that was the future. And their health was the key. So one of the elements was immunizing our children. We had immunization, but it was not organized effort. So Rajiv Gandhi had focused on set of technology missions. The idea was to bring technology to benefit people at the bottom of the economic pyramid. The idea was to use technology as an entry point to bring about generational change. The idea was to democratize technology. The missions were related to rural drinking water, literacy, immunization, edible oil, telecom, and milk production. Immunization was one of the most important missions. The idea then was to really immunize large number of children. India had the largest number of polio patients in the world, and we were not making any polio vaccine in our country. I'm sure we'll talk more about it because Jairam can give you a lot more details on how we call this meeting of polio experts and all that. But I just want to set the stage that the idea of immunization mission was also rooted in one, listening to the public, getting non-government agencies involved, open to media. So all of these ideas were rooted in institution building, rooted in role of civil society, was rooted in scientific mindset. And I see all three being challenged today in many ways. Okay. To me, these three were very fundamental. The role of civil society in immunization program, literacy program, water program was very important, NGOs. Today, civil societies have very little space. Institution building, whether starting production of vaccine in India, then India hardly made any vaccine. Today, India is the largest producer of vaccines in the world. And credit goes to initiatives taken during immunization mission. People don't understand, they have short memory. So when some people say nothing got done in last 50 years, I feel sorry for their ignorance. They don't mean what they say, and they don't say what they mean. So I think immunization journey, as we'll discuss more now, has taught us a lot of lessons. One lesson that I would emphasize today in light of what is going on is that we must listen to the voices of the people. We must invite others for ideas and input, civil society, domain experts, institutions, and we must have scientific mindset. So these are the issues I hope we can discuss, but I'm sure Jairam will have a lot to say.
So before Mr. Jairam Ramesh gives his inputs, Mr. Sam Pitroda spoke about the lessons learned. Mr. Ramesh, during those days, the media as we see it today, both conventional and non-conventional media, was, if I'm allowed to say it, in a stage of infancy as compared to what we see today. Spreading your message to and fro, both, as Mr. Sam Pitroda said, listen to people. Listening to people and talking to people was both not as easy as it has become today. So what were the challenges from a communication point of view? If you could also highlight that, we would all be very grateful.
Well, remember that the objective of the technology mission of immunization was to immunize 25 million infants every year.
Right.
20 million pregnant women every year. This was the objective. And this was not a immunization against one disease. It was to provide immunization against 6 vaccine preventable diseases: diphtheria, pertussis, which is whooping cough, tetanus, tuberculosis, polio, and measles. So really, DPT was one vaccine. So we were providing 4 vaccines, one for DPT, one for tuberculosis, one for measles, and one for polio. So 4 vaccinations for 25 million infants every year and 20 million pregnant women. So, this is a huge
massive task.
The pregnant women didn't get the polio and the measles vaccines, but the infants certainly did. So look at the magnitude of the challenge we were talking. Secondly, as Sam mentioned, some of these vaccines were being produced in India, tuberculosis vaccine, for example, but the polio vaccine, 2/3 of the world's cases of polio were in India. But the polio vaccine was being imported courtesy UNICEF. So the 2 things that were done which Sam spoke about. One, there was a huge outreach to the scientific community because the scientific community was divided whether there should be an injectable polio vaccine
Or
or an
oral.
oral polio vaccine. And in India, anything oral is obviously more administratively convenient than something that is injectable, which has its own issues. So the first challenge was to create a scientific consensus that the oral polio vaccine is the route to take. And that took, a couple of months. Secondly, to produce this vaccine in India. And we scouted around various sites. Finally, we located a site in Bulandshahr, and Bharat Immunologicals and Biologicals BIPCOL, which is now a major vaccine producer, was created. We got help from Russia for the oral polio vaccine. But simultaneously, and this is what I want to stress, simultaneously, we kept the injectable polio vaccine option open. And we got Institut Mario from France to set up a facility near Gurgaon. So creating of a scientific consensus, number one, setting up of the production, Make in India, which today, we are drum beating on Make in India. Make in India, BIPCOL was an outstanding example of Make in India. And, we set up that production facility. At the same time, Pawan, the Department of Biotechnology was also established. And it is because of the Department of Biotechnology that 10 years later, Bharat Biotech became a reality. So you see, this is all part of a sequence of events. DBT, Department of Biotechnology, gets set up in 1986. The Technology Development Board gets set up. And then you have a whole slew of new companies that come up. And Bharat Biotech, which has now produced the Covaxin. The roots of this, the foundations of this, go back to the 80s and 90s. Remember also, Pawan, that the key trigger for India becoming the world's big center for pharmaceuticals and for vaccines was certainly the establishment of the DBT. But before that, 1970, the Indian Patents Act was very important. And India recognized process patents, did not recognize product patents. And hence, what happened was a whole set of Indian companies, Ranbaxy, Cipla, Cadila, so many companies grew. And we had Indian companies, otherwise they would have been dominated by the multinationals. What I want to say is that when Prime Minister talks of Atmanirbhar, 1970 Indian Patents Act created an Atmanirbhar Indian pharmaceutical industry, which then became the world's largest producer of vaccines. So I think, and we had no social media. We hardly had any television. We had only Doordarshan, in 86 and 87. So how to communicate? So what, Sam, myself, there used to be a secretary in the Ministry of Health called Mr. P.K. Umashankar, who was a,
Ramachandran.
was Dr. Ramachandran. So we traveled to every state of the country. We made presentations on 35 millimeter slides. No PowerPoint at that time, but 35 slide with a huge projector which I had to lug. And we traveled to all the 28 states then. We made presentations to the Chief Minister. We made presentations to, the MLAs of that state. We made presentations to the local media, the local language media in order to sensitize them. This was the communication, giving people a sense of participation. This was not diya jalao, tali bajao, this was actually going out to the state governments, making state governments stakeholders in this process. No attempt at centralization. This was to empower the state governments to carry out these immunization programs of their own, but become facilitators, and not controllers and centralizers of the type that we are seeing today. So I think the immunization program, it took a long time, Pawan. It took India almost 30 years to become polio free. But there is an iconic photograph of Mr. Rajiv Gandhi putting a drop of polio vaccine, on in the mouth of an infant. The mother is holding that infant. That's an iconic photograph, which symbolized the launch of the polio. We got the Rotary Club, the International Rotary Club. They started a polio plus pulse polio campaign. So it was not just on polio; it was on tuberculosis, it was on measles, it was on DPT. So as Sam mentioned, the two things that are missing today: this massive outreach to the scientific community, listen to different points of view, don't victimize those who have a different point, but accommodate their points of view and give them a sense of participation. Jacob John, one leading immunologist of India who keeps writing now on COVID 19.
Even when he's almost 90.
The Christian Medical College in Vellore. And he had a completely different point of view on the immunization, particularly on polio. But we made him part of the system. We listened to him, we argued with him, and he participated. So that's one.
I would like to add quickly one point to what Jairam is saying. Jairam and I decided that we should listen to large number of experts. So we invited 70 experts from all over the country on polio vaccine and immunization and put them in one room for almost 2 or 3 days. And we said, we are not going to let anybody go from here until we decide whether India should benefit from oral polio or injected polio. We cannot send conflicting signals to the people of India and scare parents as to whether their children took it right or they should have done something else. That is the kind of conversation we need that Jairam is talking about. Open conversation, listening to the voices of the others. So I think the whole idea of democratic institution, the idea of communication, idea of talking to press regularly, openly, honestly, a lot of that is missing.
Pawan, there were a lot of mishaps on the way because the cold chain equipment was very weak. We did not have a cold chain equipment to store these. So there was a lot of mishaps. There were deaths because of the measles vaccine and various other. But we didn't hush up. The media, we allowed the media to report on these mishaps. We tried to hold ourselves accountable, the state governments accountable. We set up a council on social audit, which was independent experts who would verify.
That's a very important point.
Who would act as a mechanism for receiving complaints on what is going wrong. So, in fact, there were a lot of mishaps because of the fact that there was no cold chain, and we had to, set up this cold chain. And Voltas at that time played a very important role in creating and expanding this cold chain infrastructure. But the important thing is, other than this outreach to scientific community, which was a continuing process, it was virtually meeting them, on a day-to-day basis. The other thing was that we were open to criticism. We were open to, not just shutting off the doors and saying that, we know everything. There were people out there who were critical. Media was critical. They were saying that the claims that were being made were exaggerated. So we subjected this to the process of social audit, external audit, UNICEF audit. The openness was a very critical element of the immunization program that is completely missing today.
I want to sort of interrupt a little because before we change from the communication to somewhere else, India was, of course, as it is, a very diverse country. So how did you make your messaging culturally? How did you calibrate it culturally to make it acceptable? I'm sure, yes, you're right. There was resistance from the scientific. That's one resistance which is not so difficult to counter. But resistance from the target group, number one. Number two, how was the response of the opposition then? Was there resistance? And one more, last. Was there resistance from our own political leadership, or did they have open mind? You didn't have much problem in convincing the larger landscape of our own political leadership.
In fact, Pawan, although 1986-87, the Congress party was in power in most states, I have to say that the most enthusiastic response to the visits of Sam, myself, and the other members of the team were in non-Congress states. Mr. Ramakrishna Hegde in Karnataka, Mr. Jyoti Basu in West Bengal. Then we had, of course, we had M.G. Ramachandran, but at that time he was not keeping too well, and then subsequently it was President's rule in Tamil Nadu.
N.T. Ramarao
In Andhra Pradesh, undivided Andhra Pradesh. We had Mr. Nayanar in Kerala. We had quite a few non-Congress chief ministers, and we made it a point I remember in one review meeting, I raised this with Mr. Gandhi when he was, took a review of the immunization program, and I just casually mentioned, sir, the response we have had in non-Congress states has been phenomenal. So he said, I will immediately write to all the Congress chief ministers, which he did. The outreach to the MLAs of that state, the outreach to the local media, Pawan, we had local media. There was the Hindi media, Odia media, Bengali media. So we produced a lot of literature in the local languages, and UNICEF helped us in creating this. We had, in fact, when we used to go to a state, there would be one presentation to the chief minister, one presentation to the MLAs, one presentation to the local media. Whether it was Patna, whether it was Kolkata, whether it was Bhubaneswar, whether it was Bhopal, or Lucknow, we had a minimum of 3 presentations. One to the chief minister and the state government, one to the MLAs, and third was to the local media. At that time, panchayats and nagarpalikas, were not that much strong. You remember the 73rd and 74th Amendment came much later. So these were our 3 target groups, and the awareness building, the demand creation, for the immunization was really the responsibility of the state governments and the media. The media played a hugely important role.
They were very good. I must say, media was very responsive.
And remember,
definitely criticized, which is okay. But overall, media support was superb.
And we had Doordarshan, which of course we used. All India Radio was pressed into huge service. So the local media became the champions of this program. So I think the openness is most important, Pawan. It's a sense of openness. It's a sense that we are doing something. We need your cooperation. We need your involvement. We need your participation. We don't have all the answers. We are perfectly capable of making mistakes, which we will learn, which we will acknowledge. There are many occasions.
Wherever we went, it was not just about immunization. It was about all technology missions.
Sure.
Which we had to say, sorry, we are sorry. This will not occur again. And I gave you the examples of the measles.
Sure. So I would, we are talking about a government then which did not treat the opposition as enemies. They're political rivals, fine, but they were not enemies. So it was easier for you to perhaps sit with Mr. Nayanar or Mr. Jyoti Basu and try and convince them about the program, about the mission. Right now, we have a government which treats the opposition as enemies. Therefore, the challenge, I think, is way deeper, because the country then gets divided, especially when the government has a baggage of knee-jerk decisions like demonetization, like CAA. So the trust deficit for that government becomes huge. How do you think that trust deficit can be bridged as a leading opposition party? How do we try and bridge that gulf? Because the government, I'm sorry, has lost a lot of ground in terms of trust.
Well, the political atmosphere in the mid 80s certainly was not as toxic as it is today.
Right. I think that's the
Certain. And we had a government which had a great majority. Don't forget that Mr. Gandhi had 410 members of parliament. I mean, he had a working majority in the Rajya Sabha, but he had a brute majority in the Lok Sabha. But in spite of that, there were non-Congress states. Other political parties were there. But in spite of that, we went out of our way to reach out, and I think that's very important. I mean, the signal came from the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's mandate was reach out to everybody, listen to everybody, make everybody part of this, movement, the technology mission movement, so to speak. So I think, it has to start from the top. The opposition can say we will give constructive cooperation, but it takes two to clap. I mean, it's a handshake is a two-way process.
And whenever we went there, we went as a group of almost 10 people. And state government.
It's a very and if you end up playing petty politics, I'll give you a very simple example. Dr. Manmohan Singh wrote a very, very sober, very dignified, and a very constructive letter to the Prime Minister.
Yes.
Within 24 hours, he got a vituperative, he got an abusive, reply, not from the Prime Minister, but from the Health Minister. Dr. Manmohan Singh's letter was 2 pages. Mr. Dr. Harshvardhan's attack was a personalized attack on Dr. Manmohan Singh of 3.5 pages.
So between the two of you, I think both of you should give an answer to this. What are the best practices across the world in terms of the current vaccination drive on COVID, which, if you were to be asked by the Modi government, which is, of course, a dream, they would never ask you, but in case somebody were to ask you from the government, what would be the best practices you think are missing right now in our Indian vaccination drive from across the world?
Well, there are many, many issues I would like to sort of emphasize. One is you need a national credible team of domain experts who conduct daily press conferences on behalf of the government to establish facts and truth and give confidence to people as to one set of information. It cannot be political. It has to be professional. It has to be regular every day at 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, whatever, where people would tune in and say, yep, I'm getting the right picture from the experts. 2, I would, if I was there, call for consolidation of all production facilities. It is no longer about private and government. It is about national emergency. So I would take charge of all government production, private, government, all. Give private their due profit, but run it as a national emergency production line and not leave it to a local guy. Part of that would be to design one price for everybody. You cannot have this 3-tier pricing system. Okay, where you say so much for central government, so much for state government, so much for private. It just doesn't work that way. Allow private to make their profit, but decide the price at a national level and not leave it to the private. Distribution system also take charge, but at the same time allow state governments freedom and flexibility that they need to meet local conditions. And basically walk the talk. Establish credibility. Today, there is no credibility. I don't believe what they say. Okay. I have no confidence in any of their words. Okay. And then when you walk the talk, you can't tell people to wear masks and then you conduct political rallies. You can fool some of the people some of the time. But going back to your original question, establishing credibility through professionals, domain experts, and we have some great people. You know, I see some of them on TV. They are good doctors, good scientists. They know what they are doing. And if they make mistakes, it's okay for them to make mistakes. It is okay for them to misjudge something. But they will tell you the facts. We need to empower them. I mean, look at, I cannot imagine that our country is going through oxygen shortage. I just cannot comprehend. We should have thought about this a year ago. We should have prepared for the worst. We had 1 year to plan. And we gave people false promises, wrong narrative, and we are in a mess. We are a laughing stock in the global community today. And we are talking about superpower. We are blaming, enemy at the border. I mean, come on, please get our house in order. Our people are dying. And it's very painful. I've lost 4 of my brothers and sisters in the last 1 month. I know what it means. Okay. And every day, even in US, I get calls from India. Get me bed, get me oxygen. And I feel helpless. People are dying left and right. Numbers are not really telling us the whole story. Okay. So
Mr. Jairam Ramesh, if you could also respond to this and add one more aspect of the blame that the government keeps heaping on the people, vaccine hesitancy. Now, you must have also faced this during those days. So borrowing from that experience and that wisdom, of course, we are now talking about a government which has through its own errors of omission and commission, destroyed the trust. People don't trust what the government says. Yet, how do you restore some kind of a confidence in the scientific temperament so that people are not hesitant? People should ignore what the government is saying in multiple voices, but stick to what works, which is science.
Pawan, on the 24th of March 2020, Mr. J.P. Nadda, spoke to me on the phone. I had worked, he was health minister. I was a member of the standing committee on health. So, and he was environment minister in Himachal. I was environment minister here. So we had a lot of interactions. So after the lockdown on the 24th of March 2020, he called me and he said, there's a lockdown now. Is there any specific suggestion that you would like to make? I said, Nadaji, remember the Kargil war. During the time of the Kargil war, every day at 5 p.m., a civilian and a military officer did a briefing as to what had happened and what is the situation. And that was considered to be the authoritative information. I'm sorry to say that in the last year and 2 months, this system has not been put in place. We have credible people. I mean, when Dr. Guleria speaks, he speaks a lot of sense. He's director of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences.
Absolutely.
Why couldn't Dr. Guleria every day at 5 p.m., along with, a health official, but, an IAS officer is not going to cut much ice. It has to be a medical professional. You have Guleria, you have Dr. V.K. Paul, who's a member of the Niti Aayog, who's also from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences.
They're good people.
So many people. You have Srinath Reddy, who is director of the Public Health Foundation of India. You put together, a group and let them every day, 5 p.m. on certain, every day, they take the nation into confidence. People, when Fauci spoke,
Yes, of course.
Fauci's role,
Even if the president didn't want people to listen to Fauci,
Yeah.
people still went by what he was saying rather than what Trump was saying.
Fauci was 80 years old, remember? We have a lot of young people. We have first-rate people. In fact, there was one person, who used to brief regularly, Ganga Khedkar, of the ICMR, and he retired and went away to Pune. Now, I would have kept him. And I would have said, no, Ganga Khedkar, I need you. The country needs you. And I would have kept him to do the briefing. But suddenly, all of a sudden, Ganga Khedkar goes away, retired, and goes away and settled down. Maybe he was fed up, with the system. Who knows? So, Gandhi Tang, for example, she was head of the, Translational Health Research Institute. She resigned and went back to Vellore. I mean, these are all, indications that different points of view are not respected. So I think the first thing is, even now, even today, it can be done beginning tomorrow at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 4 p.m., whatever the time. Get two of the outstanding professionals in whom people can have confidence. And I would unhesitatingly say Guleria is one of them. Unhesitatingly, I would say.
In fact, last year, sorry, please come.
Let him take the nation into confidence. Number one. Number two, there is no alternative to compulsory licensing. We must introduce compulsory licensing. We must have more companies in India producing these vaccines and not just be dependent on one or two of them. We have the laws. Israel, for example, has introduced compulsory licensing. We introduced compulsory licensing for some drugs a couple of years ago. Dr. Manmohan Singh has suggested this in his letter to the Prime Minister. So I think, remember, Pawan, the Prime Minister said by August 2021, 300 million Indians would be vaccinated. This was the target, that by August 2021, 300 million Indians would be vaccinated.
Yes.
Okay. Till today, you ask yourself the question, only 10% of this target has been achieved. And that target is a modest target. 300 million is probably is a modest target. Maybe the target has to be increased 3 times.
But on the other hand, Jairam,
of 300 million, we have only done 10% so far. So we have to introduce compulsory licensing.
yeah, but on the other hand, we are saying that anybody above 18.
This is not the time to think of, market economics. This is a life and death situation. This is a national emergency. This is not, we are not looking at, market economics at this stage. You've got to expand these vaccines. Even the United States government funded the Moderna vaccine. They paid more than $1 billion or so under that Operation Speed Warp or whatever it's called, Speed Wrap. This was all publicly funded. But we are in the grip of not just the COVID virus, but we are in the grip of a ideology virus. Which looks at the public sector suspiciously, which thinks, this is the time for market economics, that this is the time that, private companies should be making profits at the pain of other, at the pain and suffering of others. So this is not the time for that.
That's true. True.
As Sam said, we have to commandeer these facilities in the national interest. And we've got to vaccinate. Vaccinate. That's the only option right now. We won't be able to travel. If anybody travels, the first question that will be asked is, are you vaccinated? So, Pawan, 300 million we were supposed to do by August. We have done only 10% of that 300 million. And that 300 million itself is probably a modest target. So, that, in my view, is the single most important area of focus as far
Pawan,
as government is.
Pawan,
Yes. It's a
when
bit
Prime Minister said that everybody above 18 will be entitled to get vaccine. If you look at India's population, roughly per year you can say 20 million people, average lifespan of 70 years, 1.4 billion. So if you take 0 to 18 out, 36 million or 400 million out, you have billion people to be vaccinated.
Sure. Sure.
Even if
So-
you vaccinate 2 million a day, which is a big number in India at this stage, you're
Right.
talking about 400 days required minimum, 400 to 500 days. I mean, somebody has to plan all this and say, look, this is not realistic. Don't make those promises.
Sure, sure. So, coming to well, let's try and conclude now. But before we conclude, I want to ask both of you, what is it that is worrying you the most when you see what's happening around us in India? And what is it that gives you some hope? Mr. Jairam Ramesh.
Well, I think it's the collapse of the state. I think, it's just, just the entire governmental machinery, in my view, is in a state of denial right now. And you cannot get on to the solution track unless you recognize what the problem is. Okay, this is a time in which a giant collective effort is needed. Make that effort. I have a feeling, Pawan, that the international ridicule that we have been subjected to over the last couple of days may trigger some meaningful action on the part of the government, because it's awful. It's really awful. I really feel ashamed to see the manner in which India is being covered. But as an Indian, I really feel diminished at seeing the reporting on India, and I feel anguished. And I hope that this is going to have some effect. The system should be responding to these criticisms and not be sending rebuttals, to any criticism that comes.
Mr. Sam Pitroda, please.
I want to add to what Jairam is saying. One, I think our democracy is fading. Our democratic institutions are attacked. It is linked to freedom, autonomy. It is linked to, institution building. As I said earlier, it is linked to the role of civil society. It is linked to lots of things. That big area of reviving our democracy, rebuilding institutions, is what is worrying me the most. It is not a temporary problem. But if you don't fix that, you're not going to fix everything else. I'm convinced of that. Okay. Two, what gives me hope is people of India. I think we have tremendous talent, lots of resilience. People have been very generous in many ways. They put up with a lot of nonsense. Okay. And people of India will rise.
Absolutely.
And that's
You're
what-
so right. You're so right. Over the last fortnight or so, we've seen the resilience. We've seen how strangers are coming to each other's help in India. That gives us a lot of hope.
People of
And-
India are just unbelievable. I tell you,
Absolutely.
no other country will have the kind of resilience you have. We have the kind of love and affection you get from neighbors,
Yes, yes,
family. Look at, all these kids are lining up in a street with bunch of, metal tubes waiting to get oxygen. I mean, where would you find that in? No other country you will have that.
These
Somebody
are-
is doing it for neighbor, somebody is doing it for uncle. you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that is the strength of India.
That's the strength of India. The opposition party has been volunteering. Dr. Manmohan Singh was not asked for any advice, yet he went out of his way to give advice. Our Congress president has been giving various suggestions. I think that's another, the robust opposition, which realizes that this is a time to act absolutely responsibly and come to the rescue of the nation. That's another strength of India, and I hope
This is not a political issue. This is a national issue.
It is.
It has nothing to do with
Absolutely.
nothing to do with opposition, nothing to do with
it. And that's what I hope the government also realizes, that this is not a political issue.
Yeah, but it has to do with the pain of the people of India. It is everybody's pain. You know, if I was there, I would go to nation and apologize first. Okay, saying, look, I'm sorry. I'm head of the government. We have messed it up, all of us. Now let's bring our best people together.
Absolutely.
To work together to get over this quickly.
Well, with that solemn thought, we wind up this episode. Thank you, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, and thank you, Mr. Sam Pitroda. Please stay safe.
Thank you, Pawan. Thank you, Jairam.
I hope all of you learned a lot from the journey that was, because this will help us prepare for the journey, a huge mammoth journey that we are about to undertake as a country in terms of vaccination against COVID. We got you the best minds that were behind that journey. We hope that the government and the authorities also are willing to learn from the collective wisdom of the country, collective experience of the country at having successfully conquered so much of despair, so many pandemics. Keep watching INC TV. Thank you.